Good afternoon. Apologies for the delays, but I would like to welcome representatives from the Climate Action Network Australia and Mr. Trail, and joining us via video conference, the Australian Conservation Foundation, Lock the Gate Alliance and Climate Works. I do understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. I will get you to state your full name and the capacity in which you're appearing today. Mr. Trail, we might start with you.
Thanks, Senator. Dr. Barry Trail. I head up a project called Solutions for Climate Australia, which is a federally focused project with Climate Action Network Australia.
Great. ACF?
I am the Program Manager for Climate and Energy at the Australian Conservation Foundation.
Thank you, Senator. I'm Suzanne Harder. I'm a Policy Advisor on Climate and Energy at the Australian Conservation Foundation.
Great. And Climate Works?
Thanks for the invitation, Senators. I'm Anna Malos from the Climate Works Centre and I'm our Australian country lead.
I'm Courtney Turner. I'm the Program Impact Manager in the Industry System at Climate Works.
We then have a Sam Moorhead and a Carmel Flint. Could you please state your name and the capacity in which you're appearing?
Yeah, I'm Carmel Flint. I'm a National Coordinator with Lock the Gate Alliance.
And I'm Sam Moorhead. I'm the Research Coordinator with the Lock the Gate Alliance.
Lovely. Thank you very much. We will go first to Senator Duniam.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for making yourselves available to be a part of the inquiry today. Treating this as a group, and I'll allow whoever wishes to go first, and under the guidance of the Chair, whoever wants to order first, go in the order they will. Just around the operation of the safeguard mechanism and the desire to achieve the 30% reduction by 2030. Has there been any analysis undertaken by anyone here about how the facilities caught up, the 215 facilities caught under this mechanism will achieve that, or how best it can be achieved with the way things are in the current landscape? If anyone you would like to...
Mr. Trail.
I'll jump up.
Oh,
sorry.
You go, Suzanne.
Thank you. What we have analysed is the impact of new entrants. So the facilities within the scheme have been assessed, and we have seen the government's numbers on that. So the emissions, the 28% proportional share that they currently make up of our overall total emissions would be the same percentage that they would make up in 2030, and that's what's driven the baseline decline rate with a reserve. So we can see those numbers. The reserve looks like it's around 17 megatons. What we don't see, however, is the impact of new entrants on that overall picture. So presumably we will have now a set carbon budget, which we would like to see legislated. And that has a number on it, so that's quite useful. We have a cap of around 1,233 megatons between now and 2030. But the problem really is that the analysis that has created the reserve it's a little bit murky, so we don't know exactly what has been included in those new entrants. But when we have commissioned some pieces of work, one by ERI, another that was a WA case study, and we have one underway right now. What we do see is a couple things. One is that there is, in fact, a pipeline of new projects, particularly new coal mines and gas facilities that will be bringing new emissions under that cap. So that's an issue with regards to either blowing out the cap if the reserve isn't big enough, and also putting a cost impost on all of the facilities, those 215 that are in the safeguard currently. But another issue that we've noted is that a further uncertainty is how expansions of current facilities will be treated and how extensions of current facilities will be treated, because those also, under a production adjusted baseline, which moves up and down with production, sort of an intensity baseline, that means an existing facility that somehow manages to tap into a new gas reserve, for example, will bring those emissions into the safeguard under an existing facility. So this all hinges around how new facilities are defined, which is a point that we have put in our submission. A new definition, or a very clear definition on facilities, will be very, very important for us to better understand those emissions that are going to come into the scheme, and whether that reserve is even close to being adequate alongside what we feel are new requirements needed for new entrants. Thank you.
Mr. Trail.
Yes.
Oh.
Thanks, Senator Dunningham. Just to follow on from what Suzanne said there, we've released a report today from Climate Analytics, which I'm happy to share with the committee if that's useful. I won't attempt to go into the details here, but it reinforces Suzanne's key point there from two other analyses previously done. There's now 3 separate analyses which show that new entrants would bring in significantly more emissions into the pipeline and risk blowing out the safeguards mechanism in a whole range of ways, affecting the ability to reach the 43% target, which is fundamental, but also flowing through on wiping out the supply of ACUs for other participants in the mechanism. So I really wanted to flag that strongly if I could. All these analyses are based on a series of assumptions about new entrants, but I would flag that they're different than the government's analysis, and that I think something, if we're not working on a firm foundation of agreed facts, that is of concern if we're trying to nail down the best outcome.
Sure. And I think Mr. McFadden, did you have, yes?
Yes, thank you. It's relevant to the question, but I guess it increases the scope of the question, if you can indulge me for a second. What we're keen to see in this bill is really a more stringent application of a hierarchy of abatement when it comes to the best ways to reduce emissions and get them down through to the weakest ways of doing so. And that hierarchy of abatement looks like facilities, particularly new facilities, demonstrating that in the first instance, they've done everything they can to minimise their emissions, then avoid those emissions and then abate them. And then, of course, what we want to see through this is a prioritisation of facilities playing in the safeguard mechanism credit market, particularly new entrants, where we think that new entrants should be entering the system at net zero so as not to overwhelm the system, and should be doing so with safeguard mechanism credits rather than offsets. So we're supportive of offsets, but we think they should be a last resort, and there should be this hierarchy of abatement being applied to facilities, particularly new facilities entering the system. If that makes sense. Thank you.
Well, look, that is helpful. And just on that, I mean, this idea of a hierarchy of sponsors, like, yeah, the Australia Institute talked about separating out sort of emitters, and there are some you could catch now and some you deal with later, and identified cement being one. I mean, is that what you're talking about, Mr. McFadden?
Yes, it is, because what we want to see is a greater, I guess, product differentiation between those industries that are high emissions and need to, over time, leave the Australian economy, particularly fossil fuels, from those facilities that we want to see stay in the Australian economy, even though they're high emissions, but provide a facility that helps them to abate their emissions in the best possible way. So cement, aluminium refining would be in that category. And we don't want any perverse outcome in the scheme that makes it more difficult for those industries that are high emissions to get their emissions down under the safeguard, because they're in some ways being inadvertently penalised by the system, because we're still trying to cater for coal and gas projects, especially new entrant coal and gas projects, making, for example, safeguard mechanisms more difficult or more expensive to acquire, or by fossil fuel companies, I guess, hoovering up ACCUs to the detriment of facilities that we want to see remain in the Australian economy, like cement, and aluminium refining and so forth, them in some ways being disadvantaged because we've tried to create a system that caters for new coal and gas entrants.
So just on that though, I mean, like you've talked about ways of abating, and offsets are a last resort, I think has been stated. And so obviously you would prefer to take other avenues, but in the instance of say cement or aluminium refining and manufacturing, I mean, what options do they have to deal with their excess emissions over the baseline?
Oh, quite a few over time, and more opportunities for industries like aluminium refining and cement, technological advances that allows them to reduce their emissions over time. But there are currently options available to them. I mean, Rio Tinto is currently actively engaged with various state governments and NGOs such as ours to look at how to decarbonise their significant aluminium and alumina refining emissions. So there are opportunities available to them, but it does come back to my point that they will need to access safeguard mechanism credits. That's where we want to see those the market we want those industries playing in. We do acknowledge the government's concern about there is at the moment, it's difficult to know the initial availability of safeguard mechanism credits and the extent to which there'll be enough at the start of the scheme. And that's why, while we don't support unlimited indefinite offsets, we understand that's the government's position, and we'd like to see a design feature in the mechanism that reduces the reliability and accessibility of offsets over time from that unlimited commitment that the government has down to a much smaller figure by 2030. And we recognise that even the government's own Reputex modelling through its departmental briefings says models that SMCs will make up about 20% of the safeguard mechanism system by 2030, and we'd like to see that built into the system so that there's a gradual but demonstrative reduction in offset reliance between now and 2030.
And so just on this reliance on offsets, I mean, there's been modelling, and I think to take it as you will, but the Minerals Council suggested that there would be a 200% shortfall in the amount of SMCs available. So, you know, there are some figures out there around the inability to actually access these credits. The alternative is the penalty. I mean, for those who can't meet their target or go under their target, and therefore no SMCs are generated. Are you comfortable with the penalty that's built into this legislation?
I'll make a brief comment and then cut to Suzanne, who is the author of our submission. But the submission does include, reforms, I guess, or recommendations around reporting, around an increase in the discretion of the regulator and some tightening of the penalty provisions in the current design, as well as an increase around transparency and the public availability of documentation so that the public has much more transparency with how penalties are applied and treated. Suzanne, I just want to invite you, if you've got anything to add to that.
Just make two comments, one with regards to ACCUs and one with regards to SMCs. So the first is that the conversation is extremely binary around ACCUs. It's either unfettered use for existing and new facilities or you know, strict limits, but that's not really where it is. For example, we've suggested that limits could be sector specific. They can be set on a percentage basis. They can be phased in over time. So there's other ways of getting at this so that you can still actively have sufficient limits and you can carve out those hard to abate industries as well. But with regards to SMCs, so it's true, we've recommended that SMCs be treated favorably be accessed before ACCUs can be accessed, because they do represent more genuine abatement. And I won't get into the integrity concerns around ACCUs, but we still have them. SMCs do represent more genuine abatement as long as you genuinely remove headroom, which it looks as though we're working to do. However, provisions like banking which allow facilities to come in and even potentially hoard SMCs in the system, would get in the way of that SMC supply, safeguard mechanism credit supply that you just mentioned. So one thing would be get rid of the banking provision as one provision to address that. The other thing is that when we look at the incline of new facilities over time that would require those SMCs, they don't all start in 2023. In fact, there's quite a gradual incline for a while, and then past 2030, we see more emissions coming into the system. So it's not necessarily the case that they will all need those SMCs right off the bat when the supply is short.
Sure. Although if you've got that steady 4.9% per annum reduction, as is profiled in or proposed under what we're talking about here, there is going to be a requirement, I would have thought, like because some of the people industries I've spoken to have said that they might be able to achieve a lot more later on once tech speeds up that they've been investing in. So I'm just wondering how what you said is consistent with what they are saying.
Sorry, that they would be able to create more SMCs over time?
Well, no. So if they've got to make 4.9% per annum
Yes.
reduction every year until 2030, it's not going to be a case of greater reliance later on. They're going to rely as much now, probably more so, because tech hasn't come online in the case of some industries who are looking to transition out of some source of energy generation and into something less carbon intensive. So if they're not at that point now and they need to reduce by 4.9% but can't, so they need to, well, they're going to have to get ACCUs really, or pay a penalty. What you were saying though was that they might rely more on these. Are you talking specifically about SMCs towards the end? Is that when they become more available?
I think we're talking about two similar but slightly different things. So the existing facilities and new entrants. So it is true, existing facilities will immediately face that 4.9% decline rate, and they'll need to manage that annually. So we would hope that that would trigger investments in mitigation technology right off the bat. But for a period of time, yes, they will be looking to see who's below their baseline to access SMCs. New entrants, however, I guess is what I was referring to, because one of the things that we suggested is that new entrants should come in at zero or net zero, only with access to SMCs as opposed to ACCUs. And that's what I was referring to in terms of those new entrants coming online, needing to access SMCs, and the supply of SMCs being generated over time.
Okay, and so to that end, just on SMCs, I mean, there's no modelling as far as I'm aware that sort of predicts how many will be available. It's all a little unclear. And so new entrants who will rely on them to be able to get their business off the ground. I mean, are you suggesting that we not allow them have access to ACCUs for the intervening period until SMCs become more available? Because that would seem to have perhaps a damaging effect on potential economic growth opportunities.
Yeah, do you want me to continue on? Yes, I understand what you're saying. So there's a lot of different ways, as I mentioned, that you could address an issue like this. For example, you could set limits on ACCU use and SMC requirements that are sector-based, genuinely hard to abate sectors and genuinely necessary industries or new entrants could be set in a category. For example, they could have a slightly higher access to ACCUs or come in a slightly above net zero. So our point is, however, that the new entrants, particularly fossil fuel entrants that are bringing significant emissions into the scheme, from what we can see from modeling, that is the large entrants is fossil fuel entrants, which is why we're focusing so much on setting requirements that would stop them from bringing huge emissions into the scheme, penalizing everyone else, creating more work under the current carbon budget, and potentially trying to offset fossil fuel emissions with land sector offsets, which in and of itself is problematic. So we're trying to address that situation by putting this net zero requirement in place without access to ACCUs in the first instance. But again, you could do a carve out for certain industries, certain sectors, hard to abate.
I'm going to share
just-
the call, Senator Dunning.
Oh, sorry. Yep. No.
Thank you. Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this hearing today. Obviously, there's lots of questions still to be answered because we don't have all of the data and all of the information. I'm looking forward to a good session with the department tomorrow to try and get to the bottom of some of that. But I'm wondering if any of you have done your own calculations on what you expect the total emissions from new entrants are expected to be.
I'll have a first go, Senator. Climate Analytics released a report we commissioned today. I'd happily go through the figures, but unfortunately my computer's just run out of juice. I can't remember them.
Okay.
Apologies because of the delay. But I'm happily share that. But in the broad, and this was repeated as Gavin and Suzanne from ACF mentioned in two previous assessments by different researchers coming to similar conclusions, is that the modelling shows that very large, the new entrants will bring, both coal and gas, will bring in very large volumes, potentially to the total number of emissions of ACCUs that would be assessed, the total number of ACCUs that would be required under current projections, the current government projections, 100% or more. So I'll share those figures. Apologies, machine's just down. I can't produce the figures. Our report's just out today.
Okay, well, if someone from your team could perhaps email them through to the Secretariat, that would be great, and we can have them tabled. Does anybody else want to jump in relation to that question?
I think this is ACF's report that I'm referring to, so if they want to go, they can, but the ERI report suggested 11.4 million tonnes per annum to 28.4 million tonnes per annum by 2030 from new fossil fuel entrants, and it looked only at the most likely new entrants, those which were very well advanced, and was based predominantly on the company's own figures, but it also included Beetaloo Basin emissions based on Reputex estimates, based on some work that Reputex did for us a couple of years ago.
If I could follow on from that, again, Senator, and I think this goes back to a point I made previously, is that we can only go on the available data.
Yes.
And to some extent it is grey, trying to predict whether a gas or a coal company is 100% going to do X in 2030 is not a black and binary piece of data. But there's three different assessments have all come to similar figures. They're different to the government figures, and we'd really like to flag that as a significant issue, not to simply point to one set of those numbers and say these are absolute, because they're not. But whenever there's a debate on a situation and there is mixed data and no foundation of agreed facts on something as fundamental as this, you can easily end up in an echo chamber of people talking from different data sets and going nowhere. So I'd really like to emphasise the need to get to a common understanding, or at least if there are disagreements on those future predictions, what are the different underlying assumptions there?
All we need to do is look at the discrepancy of the methane reporting to understand how crucial it is that we actually know what figures we're working from. Thank you. The government themselves has named 7 gas projects that will start before 2030. They haven't identified the coal projects that will proceed, and perhaps this goes to the elements, Ms Flint, that you were just touching on there, but has anyone done any work on which coal or other gas projects you expect to commence under the policy as currently announced?
Well, we don't see any impediments to any new coal projects under the policy, really. So there's a whole suite of coal projects and expansions currently on foot. In New South Wales, there's 8 new coal projects, expansions currently proposed, including the Glencore Yancoal Hunter Valley operations, which is the largest thermal coal expansion in New South Wales since the Paris Agreement. So these are very, very large projects. And then in Queensland, there's a whole raft of projects, including projects like Whitehaven Coal's proposed new Winchester South coal mine. So basically, we think there's going to be a whole lot of new coal projects come into the scheme. And we haven't seen anything that it would create any impediment, given we're dealing with companies that have just made windfall profits and a very good position to buy ACCUs. So that's how we see it'll play. In our experience, the coal sector has done little or nothing to reduce emissions to date. So they're well placed to do well out of a sort of industry average baseline. There's a whole suite of tools they could be using that the IEA has identified right now to reduce their direct methane emissions, which they're not using. Professor Ian Lowe reviewed a whole set of projects in New South Wales and found that the measures they were using wouldn't do anything substantial to mitigate methane emissions. So we have a huge problem with coal and gas. They're effectively unregulated at present in terms of direct emissions, is our view.
So that's the current players, let alone those that may come in as new entrants under this scheme.
That's right.
That touches on some of the issues that I was asking the industry groups earlier today, both the Chamber of Commerce and AI Group, that those sectors that are genuinely hard to abate seem to be getting the raw end of the deal under this scheme. Is that a fair assessment? Anyone? Yep.
Mr. Trail?
Yeah, look, I think it goes back to a very fundamental point here, is as currently constructed, the safeguards mechanism is sector blind. But to go back to earlier comments, is the lithium industry is not the same materially as the gas and coal industry. The gas and coal industry, their fundamental product is polluting, and that has enormous consequences economically, socially, environmentally, of course. That's not the same with a lithium mine or an iron ore mine or a copper mine, whatever. So there's, we're constructing a situation here at the current trajectory where we're having very large new entrants coming in that will have the potential to massively increase the pollution of an industry that globally is on the way out. And how do we construct a situation? And I believe, and I think my colleagues online will also support the fact that it should not be sector blind. They're materially different circumstances because they're materially different pollution and outcomes. Yes for cement, yes for aluminium, yes for steel, transport, etc. But the fossil fuel industry is not like that. It's an industry that needs to, for the global good, and it's very rare you can say that unequivocally, the global good will disappear sooner or later. And so how do we construct a situation with the legislation, regulations, the templates to put in place that maximises that so we get the public good without affecting those genuinely hard to abate, at least with current technology, those generally hard to abate industries, which we still want there in 10 or 20 or 30 years.
What do you think happens in a situation like a new project like Scarborough? We've just seen Woodside announce $6.5 billion worth of profit today, up over 200%. I mean, this is a company that is making windfall profits off the global crisis we're in. And when I mean crisis, I mean what's going on in the Ukraine. What does this scheme do for projects like new entrants like Scarborough if it's set at 5% rather than if it was 100%?
I'd like to just, sorry.
No, you go.
Sorry, I was just going to quote from a report. So we did commission a case study that was just focused on the pipeline of new entrants in WA, and that prominently featured Woodside, because Woodside was going to be responsible for the vast majority of those new emissions. And one of the concluding comments was that if loopholes in the safeguard aren't addressed, the cost of abating what they figured was only about 220 million tons of, this is just the scope 1, the scope 3 was enormous, but scope 1 that they didn't already have abatement plans in their documentation for, just that little portion of a massive amount was going to mean a cost transfer of about $9 billion at current carbon prices. So that was a cost transfer because bringing those emissions into the scheme was ultimately going to go to other industries and other businesses and ultimately be borne by other Australian businesses and ultimately passed on to Australian consumers. And they said that Woodside was the primary beneficiary of what is an effective subsidy with a cost of abating the direct residual emissions from its new projects totaling around $7.6 billion passed on to other industry. So it's quite, the numbers are very significant and they're a big contributor to the emissions that are likely to enter.
I guess our additional concern, Senator, is that, and it comes back to Suzanne's earlier point about the need to tighten anti-avoidance definitions in the bill, where what Woodside will intend to do, very likely, will be to treat the Scarborough project as an expansion or an extension of its existing operations on the Burrup Peninsula because of the existing infrastructure it has there, and not be treated as a new entrant, which it should be, which we still think is a problem with this bill. That's an area that definitely needs to be tightened. And secondly, again, coming back to this unfettered, indefinite, unlimited use of ACCUs, is that Woodside will simply attempt to offset its way to net zero, which will be a paper outcome and not an outcome that actually substantially reduces emissions in the real world.
And what about then also the integrity of these safeguard mechanism credits? And we've had serious concerns raised around the integrity of credits, not just land-based credits here in Australia, but internationally. We know that they are riddled with a lot of spin and not a lot of rigour. There's examples of forest in PNG being destroyed, even though it's being claimed to be protected, for example. What's your view, and I think this particularly to ACF, what's your view around the integrity of the SMCs?
Thanks, Senator. I'll jump in, and Gav, feel free to jump in with me. So that's correct, and thank you for bringing that up. So ACF was involved in some early investigations, and obviously Andrew McIntosh from the ANU has done quite a significant amount of work here, but we did some serious investigation as well with regards to the avoided deforestation method. And when we looked at that method and the claims that were being made around the ACCU generation coming off of it, the numbers just did not add up in any way, shape, or form. It became very clear that around 1 in 5 of those ACCUs that were being generated had to have been junk. They had to have been more or less, well, they weren't worthless because people were paying for them, but they weren't worth the ton of abatement that was being claimed. Then we had the Andrew McIntosh come out with further concerns around 2 other methods, human-induced regeneration and landfill gas, and that prompted the Chubb review. And that's great. It's good that the Chubb review happened and that there will be an additional integrity commission added, but there are still concerns around the integrity of ACCUs, particularly with regards to the safeguard.
Just one more.
Because those 3 methods that have so many concerns wrapped around them have multiple projects that already exist. And the thing that Chubb was unable to do, obviously would have taken a lot of time, was on-ground audits, more investigation into the other methods. But in terms of those 3 methods, the projects that will be generated between now and 2030 under those very problematic, potentially very low integrity methods could be the equivalent of more than 60 million ACCUs. And if you look at the total abatement that will occur under the safeguard, it's 205 million tonnes by 2030. So if you assume that 60 million tonnes could be offset through low integrity ACCUs, that represents a very significant concern. So in our view, there needs to be additional measures put in place to make sure that safeguard facilities cannot access low integrity, particularly low integrity ACCUs that will be generated in the system. There can be protections wrapped around that. And then moving forward, we obviously need to ensure high integrity ACCUs only. And then, as we've already said, limitations on ACCU use overall.
I've got a final question, but I can't help but just point out this terminology of low integrity credits. It just does my head in. We're talking about shams and junk credits and credits that look nice on paper but actually aren't delivering much for the environment. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I'll just make one further thing. And offsetting fossil fuel emissions that are going into the atmosphere immediately and will be there for many, many, many years with a sham credit is extremely concerning.
Yes.
Could I just add
Yes, sure.
a necessary point there? Even if you had, Senator, the absolute best carbon credits available, offsets available, they're still not the equivalent of stopping pollution going in the air. Regenerating, protecting forests is vital, but your offset may be burnt, it may die in a drought, there may be unforeseen management changes in 100 years. They're not the equivalent even when they're the highest integrity. And there's been some pushback from the government, some people saying, oh, we'll apply a discount rate then to allow for those risks. There's no foundational science. This is my trade. There is no foundational science to estimate what those risks are of a drought or a fire in 50, 70, 80, 100 years. So you can't apply a discount rate that has any validity. They're not the equivalent.
Well, this comes back to this point, isn't it, that it's not just about balancing the amount of carbon pollution in the atmosphere. We actually have to draw down. We actually have to stop producing so much pollution in the first place, not just finding another piece of paper to say, ledger to write it up on.
Indeed.
I'm interested in the view, particularly of ACF, but any of the other groups before us today, of the assistance of a climate trigger in our environment laws to deal with this issue. I mean, I just find it crazy that we have environment laws that give a green tick to projects that are actually going to continue to destroy the environment through climate damage. Is a climate trigger something that you would like to see?
Thanks, Senator. So ACF's position is that there should be no new coal and gas approvals in Australia. And we hold that view because we know the best climate science says so. UNFCCC, the IPCC, the International Energy Agency and so forth all agree with that view. So then the question becomes how you do that. There would be ways potentially of doing that in a design feature of the safeguard mechanism, but we're not ideological about that. There may be other ways. Another option before the government will be EPBC reforms due in the next 12 months or so, hopefully by the end of the year. There'll be several ways to strengthen the way climate impacts are addressed in our national environment laws. A climate trigger is at the moment kind of classified as a grab bag of ways to reform the EPBC. There'll be several ways that we'll need to insert climate into the EPBC. The climate trigger is one, but not the only way of doing that. And we're certainly sympathetic to a view that would enable reforms to the EPBC to, if not rule out new coal and gas, make sure that any facility particularly any new coal and gas facility, over 100,000 tonnes, so therefore triggered as a facility in the safeguard to be assessed for its climate impacts under the EPBC as it enters the safeguard mechanism system.
Thank you.
Thanks. Can I just quickly ask ClimateWorks, your recent Energy Transitions Initiative report, it shows that some key sectors covered by the reforms need flexibility in implementing abatement this decade. Can you just give us the quick elevator pitch on that, on why that is?
On why it is that they need flexibility.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Just checking that it's on why it is that they need flexibility specifically.
Yes, the
It does
flexibility
go a bit
piece.
back
Why
to-
do they need flexibility? There's quite the argument going on about whether there should be flexibility or whether there should not be flexibility. I'm just trying to sort of tease out why you think that there should be flexibility.
Yeah, so we looked in the industry ETI analysis at technology pathways from 2020 to 2050, and there's a very different picture for each of the supply chains that we looked at, and the technology picture is more or less certain across those supply chains. And it kind of gets back a little bit to Senator Dunniam's question about why sometimes it's harder to do things and why it's not. So really it is about whether the technologies are clear and ready to be deployed. And for some of them, they're still looking at emerging technologies, and there are multiple technology pathways that need to be resolved. So where there is that level of uncertainty, we've done emissions modelling across the economy, seeking a lowest cost emissions reduction pathway to understand what that looks like. And we've showed that you can get to a 92% emissions reduction. What it means in practical terms for policy measures is that you can't get there without a coordinated approach. That coordinated approach includes finance, government and industry action. And that coordinated approach would include understanding better what the technologies are in relation to that. I would just jump in to talk a little bit more about the modelling, if that's helpful.
Sure. Brief, but we'll keep it brief.
Yes, I do. So the ClimateWorks and CSIRO modelling that we've done show that the sectors we looked at have substantial opportunities to reduce emissions on the least cost pathway. And across the industry sector, we calculate from the modelling that the rate of emissions intensity declines per year by an average of 8% between 2023 and 2030 in a scenario that limits warming to 1.5 degrees.
Thank you. So in terms of that sort of investment and everyone playing their part that you were referring to before, what do the mechanisms include, like the safeguard, the Powering the Regions funding, the National Reconstruction Fund? What you're saying is that all of that type of activity needs to work together? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, so we called that a nationally coordinated approach, and it could mirror for industry what is happening in energy as an example. It would link work supporting innovation and encouraging investment, developing skills and jobs for new industries, and a place-based approach for renewable energy industrial precincts, for example.
And do you see, if all of this was to work together, this is assuming that the bill passes and the safeguard mechanism does get reformed, do you see there being a job tick up or tick down? Because again, that's another debating point.
Yeah, jobs go up in the report that we looked at. So we're looking at 1.35 million jobs out to 2050. And there are a range of capital expenditure and operational expenditure jobs just based on capital investment in renewable energy.
And so if the safeguard mechanism is not amended and the new safeguard mechanism and rules do not come into being, How does that impact in terms of the kind of modelling you've done and your assumptions in the report that you released last week?
So interesting and a kind of a good point to kind of differentiate on. The model that we look at doesn't do facility level analysis, but we can aggregate up to have a kind of a broader look at subsectors. So impossible really to say what would happen if there was no safeguard or if there was. We modelled a carbon budget approach with a series of policy mechanisms in them, and I'd have to double check, but I think existing policies were included in our incremental scenario.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Senator Pocock.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions for Canna and Dr. Trail. Thank you for your time, everyone, this afternoon. I'm interested in your recommendation around a carbon mitigation hierarchy and how a hierarchy could be enforced.
I'll actually pass to Suzanne, our colleague, who will have a more precise answer, I think, Senator. We're agnostic on how it could be done, but a simple bureaucratic enforcement mechanism where a company was obliged to look at the market, track the market for CMCs, for safeguard mechanism credits, before pursuing ACCUs, would, I think, be relatively straightforward to construct. But in saying that, I will defer to Suzanne, who's a better policy detail person than me.
Thank you, Barry. So there are different ways that this could be done. So the hierarchy is what Gav mentioned earlier, which is the minimise, avoid, abate, and use ACCUs as the last resort. So there are ways of requiring facilities covered by the safeguard mechanism to demonstrate that they have taken those steps and taken steps to achieve genuine on-site emissions reduction before they gain access to the purchase of SMCs or ACCUs. So just in the way that the safeguard mechanism currently requires a plan to be provided to access the multi-year monitoring periods. In that case, facilities have to show that at the end of the multi-year monitoring period, through X, Y, and Z, through the various actions that they will take, their emissions will be below baseline at the end of the period. You could have a similar requirement where they would need to provide a report to the regulator, to the clean energy regulator, that could document those steps that had been taken on site. You could even, if you wanted to go further, you could put an audit around that to ensure that they had taken advantage of all available opportunities. But certainly it could be a reporting requirement in the first instance.
Thank you, Ms. Harder. And just on that point, in the explanatory memorandum, it says that if a facility is using SMCs above 50% of their baseline, there's a discount on those SMCs. When it comes to the use of ACCUs, should there be a discount over a certain percentage if you are trying to drive people towards that hierarchy?
If I could,
I would suggest that there should be an extra impost over a certain percentage use. So we would want excessive use of ACCUs. This is in a situation where we didn't have strict limits, which we prefer, but you could do a threshold whereby facilities that are accessing over a certain percentage of ACCUs to meet their annual obligations under the safeguard would then have to pay an extra levy or an impost on each additional ACCU that was used. And one option would be to put that levy into a fund that would fund additional abatement. That funding could even go into household electrification or energy efficiency or small businesses, but it could be an income generator and it could be assessed at excessive use of ACCUs.
Do you have a view on that threshold?
Well, what was mentioned earlier is that the government modeled a 20% ACU use in 2030. We don't know what happened until then because that hasn't been revealed, but we do know that 20% was considered an acceptable level in 2030. So you could start with consideration of a 20% threshold, but certainly you could go up and down from there.
And then in your report, you recommended that the word net be removed from the object of the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act. I'm just interested in why you think that's a significant change and what would the ramifications be?
Is that directed at ACF?
Yes, please.
Okay, yes, sorry. Yeah, so we did. Now, first off, we did welcome the fact that emissions decline was included as an object of the Act. So we want to start with a positive comment there. That was a welcome addition. Our recommendation, however, was that the word net should be removed from that object. And the reason for that is because embedding net in the object of the Act basically embeds use of offsets. So net is exactly what that implies. And it was our feeling that if you removed net, it wouldn't remove access to ACUs, but it would limit them substantially.
Okay.
So we just wanted that update in the object.
Thank you. And then for Canna, in your submission, you said that there should be reporting on emissions reduced on site versus emissions that were reduced using offsets. What should be reported? Do you have any ideas around the mechanism for that to increase the transparency?
Oh, look, I think it'd be pretty straightforward again in the reporting on to the energy regulator on their requirements under the safeguard, the range of reporting requirements under safeguards, reporting on how the abatement was delivered, what was done on site, genuine reductions on site, what was through safeguard mechanism credits, what was done by ACUs, and not that anything else is on the table, but if something else is on the table, reporting on those. We see that as quite a straightforward and non-burdensome requirement, given that the company has to report on their abatement figures. And will have done their own mathematics very simply to determine how that was done. We don't see that as burdensome at all.
So they're doing it anyway, just make it public so it's transparent?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Payman.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for being here and for your submissions. Just going off Senator Grogan's line of questioning for Climate Works, can you please explain, does the Energy Transitions Initiative work show a need to offset a residual amount of emissions to get to net zero by 2050?
There is a residual in the findings that we have of around 8%, and what we've said is
Sorry, can I just stop you? I wonder, Ms Turner, you're very, very difficult to hear. I wonder if you could take, I'm not sure if your microphone is on those headphones and maybe it's not really helping us. Sorry.
Is that a bit better?
A little bit. Thank you.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Senator. Yes, we do find that there is an 8% residual at the end. I think important to know that the model that we use does have inputs for land sequestration. So we look for emissions reductions first, some land sequestration which comes through, and then there is a 92% emissions reduction that we show across the sectors.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. And I'm just going to open the floor. I'm going to ask some questions and whoever wants to jump in can jump in, like Senator Duniam did. So if the choice is between the existing safeguard mechanism and government purchase of offsets, or the reforms proposed by this bill, which is better for the environment?
I'll have a top of the head response, Senator. I'm tempted to go to the old, it's a hypothetical, we don't deal in hypotheticals, but I won't do that. There's fundamental issues around offsets, as we talked about. To reiterate, they're not the equivalent of avoided pollution because of long-term risks, even for high integrity offsets. So if government funding was just being taken from polluters to buy offsets and it was just done in a slightly different way, I can't, top of the head, I can't war game all the pieces at once, but I don't think that would be materially different for the environment. You know, it would come down to the details of how the offsets were bought, the regulatory environment, the details. It would come down to a lot of details. That would be my short response.
If I can add, Senator Gavin from ACF. So if we're really referring to access of the $600 million allocation in the Powering the Regions Fund, our view would be that that facilities should not be allowed to access public money for the purchase of ACCUs, especially the fossil fuel sector. We actually welcome the federal government's commitment thus far, as we saw in the last October budget, to begin to remove public funding for the fossil fuel sector. There were some significant gains there, and we wouldn't want to see a retrograde step where fossil fuel entrants that we would like to see exit the Australian economy be able to access public funds in order to purchase access. That would be another subsidy to the fossil fuel sector.
So I'm just curious to know that if the Parliament does not agree to this reform of the safeguard, and in what, I guess, quoting you, would it be a retrograde step for us to, you know, are we able to wait another decade to debate how emissions can be reduced from these sectors?
Mr. Trail.
No, we absolutely can't wait another decade, Senator. As to the immediate question of, you know, the tough political question in front of all of us in different ways is, you know, do you let it through? You know, do you get it through even if it's not perfect versus it's nowhere near good enough? That'll depend for myself. I'm not trying to speak for colleagues, but for Climate Action Network, that'll depend on the details. You know, that will depend on the details of improvements that could be made and we think should be made. Now, and again, to go back to, I think, the core of our submission from ourselves, and I know from many other allied organisations, is can we deal with the issue around unfettered offset use to avoid the risks there, and can we deal with the problem of new entrants where you have potentially very large fossil fuel polluters coming on and then causing massive distortions in the system, how it works, but of course fundamentally also in more pollution.
You mentioned...
Jump in if I may. Because I think with one of the things we found that ClimateWorks has found over the years in all our work looking at these kind of least cost reduction pathways and whether that applies to heavy industry, like the work that my colleague Kylie has been talking about, is what matters is that you are getting a consistent signal, so that there is a signal to industry that it has to reduce its emissions, that there's a signal to investors about what the pathway forward is, and that, you know, that the policy, whatever it is driving towards the overall reductions in economy that Australia needs, so that it's in line with the Paris Agreement, with getting to net zero emissions in a way that, you know, is with integrity and fits with our national accounts. So if the safeguard mechanism drives that signal, it will work. If it doesn't, then, you know, we are just kind of moving emissions around the economy.
Just to...
And if I can just round that off to say, on ACS perspective, is that we want the safeguard mechanism to pass. We want the regulations and the bill to pass. We want this mechanism operational by the 1st of July. That's our position, with the improvements that we've suggested, which we think will strengthen the safeguard mechanism substantially and actually make it a good mechanism. It's not necessarily our preferred option for emissions reduction. We understand it, and we retain significant concerns around new coal and gas projects being approved, but we would like to see the safeguard mechanism pass with the improvements we've suggested, and we've been urging all parties involved to work constructively to see that happen.
Thank you. So just to reiterate, you don't think there's any reason not to pass the bill if you think reforms could be improved?
Well, we think there are a lot of reasons not to pass the bill in its current form. They're the improvements that our submission wants to see. So we've tried to produce submissions into this process that provide design feature improvements that we think deliver a good mechanism that will achieve real emissions reduction. So that's a significant caveat, right, to that the mechanism being passed. But we think they're reasonable and deliverable improvements that means that this scheme will go a significant way to delivering what is intended by the bill.
Okay, and just finally, from my understanding, the primary purpose of the bill is to allow for crediting below facilities baseline. Why do you think that is an important reform?
Can I have a crack at that, Suzanne, or do you want me? Go ahead.
You happy for me to go? Yes, we actually do support that part of the bill. And the reason for that, it does provide, as Anna just mentioned, a signal, an important signal for facilities that are able to reduce under their baseline decline rate to do so, to invest in the technologies that they do have available and pushing adoption. So adding and safeguard mechanism credits are more reliable, more genuine options for that reason. They exist within the safeguard, and it keeps the emissions reduction in the safeguard. So that's a positive. There is a residual concern, and that is that they are automatically generated. So if the headroom that currently exists in the production adjusted baselines isn't totally removed, then we do have a bit of an issue there because they'll be generated for abatement that doesn't occur. But philosophically, we do support the safeguard mechanism credits being part of the safeguard mechanism.
Okay. Thank you. That's all from me, Chair.
Thank you. Great. Thank you so much for all taking the time to be with us today, and apologies for the delay. We do appreciate your patience and your efforts in contributing to this inquiry.